Hi, I'm Steve Hopkins, and this is the PongNow interview series where we discuss table tennis with some of the best players and personalities in the sport. Today I'm with Hall of Fame member Richard McAfee. Richard had a solid career as a player and club director and sport promoter. He's been involved in the Junior Olympics. He was competition manager for table tennis at the Olympics and the World Cup. He received IOC's Olympic Merit Award and a long list of other awards. And for years now, he's been traveling the world as an ITTF course conductor and trainer. Welcome to PongNow, Richard.
Hi, Steve. Good to see you.
Well, good to see you too. I hope you're staying well. I think for a while there, I was seeing you at tournaments pretty regularly, usually with a large brace over your knee. How are you feeling?
It's been a while since you've seen me. I think in the last 5 years, I've had both knees replaced. So no more braces, getting around a lot better.
All right. Well, that's all positive stuff. And I've been watching you on Facebook with all of your posts and seeing that you're getting around a lot better. All right, so we were talking before we got into this, and you were telling me a little bit about meeting Diane and working in the mental health field. So let me start with meeting your wife, both working in the medical field, and then somehow winding your way back into table tennis. How did that happen?
Well, Diane and I both worked for Smoky Mountain Mental Health in the Western North Carolina. Diane was in the office, and I was back as in the back working with the kids who we were working with, which were in a special program for aggressive, violent behavior, which was rather interesting. There's a lot of wild stories out of that. But that's actually where we met, and didn't take too long, about 1.5 years, and we decided to get married. And then I brought her home after about 3 months, a real exciting present. I had received a job offer from Yvonne Cronledge in Maryland to come up and be the executive director for the Maryland State Association Table Tennis, and also to run a new training center, which should be called the Eastern Training Center for Table Tennis, on the grounds of an old mental hospital. And I said, well, somehow there's a mental hospital connection with me. I don't know what it is. I always used to tell the kids that came there, I can either train you or commit you. I know I know both sides of that coin. And we put, why my wife of just three or 4 months decided to stay with me when I told her we were going to sell the townhome and move up to Baltimore. And we did. The first night was really exciting because we got there and we were using old hospital buildings and from the 1930s, and they were huge. We had one building for a dormitory and one building for a training hall. And we were actually building our apartment inside that dormitory. Volunteers were building it, and it wasn't completely done when we got there. And the first night we had driven all the way up from Carolina with a big moving truck, biggest one we could find. We got there. There were a few beds, so we managed to fall asleep. We weren't there an hour before we found out the other residents of the area were local skunks. And so now my wife is taking a look at these buildings in need of repair that we're going to live in, and the skunks are firing. So this was the start of our traveling the country for table tennis, and bless her heart, Diane and my daughter Sarah, went through a lot in order for me to be able to make a career in table tennis.
So before we get too far past that, how long did that resident training program run?
It ran 2 years. It was supposedly what they were doing was going to renovate all those old buildings into different sports and create something like the Olympic Training Center, but on a sport version, statewide version of that.
Okay.
And after a couple of years, they ran out of money and they had some management problems, and it ended up closing. But we had 2 very good years. National team trained there. We had some of the very good players that came and lived in the facility. We could house 25 people. We had 11 full-time juniors from around the country that lived there.
All right, let's do some name dropping. Who would we recognize?
Well, first one you would recognize is Virginia Sung, who's now the CEO of USA Table Tennis. It was one of our initial residents, and she was there the whole time. She had just come from China. She was very young. So we were house parents to all these kids. My wife had to cook 3 meals a day for them, And if you ever cook for 11 hungry kids, that's a big job. We trained every day. What were some of the other ones? Carlos Coe, Eduardo Coe, Jason St. George, who was a U.S. High school champion for 3 years, came out of that program. There were some other kids that are no longer involved. Shelton Dixon. We even had a young lady from France that came and stayed and trained.
Okay.
We had a good group. We took them all up and down the East Coast and around the country in competition. We had a special arrangement with the state of Maryland so that they could attend the local high schools, and we received a lot of support for it. It was a very good program for a couple of years.
All right, so let's work backwards a little bit. When did you start playing? How old were you?
I played, as a young kid in the boys club in Orlando, Florida, which is my hometown. And I played a lot. And also at the local tennis club, had a table. And the 2 were right next door to each other, and I was getting thrown out of one and thrown out of the other quite a bit as a kid. So I was always playing table tennis. I also played a lot of tennis and competitively, and ended up teaching tennis for a number of years. But table tennis was always the big thing. But I was 13 years old. I was the state boys club champion and thought I was really good. And they actually had a new table tennis club form in Orlando that was actually formed out of the Martin Marietta company that were making the Saturn rockets and things. And all the members were from that company originally. And I was the first kid. And I went to play my first tournament in 1963. And of course, I didn't win a game, But what was wonderful was we had 2 visitors playing in the finals. One was Saul Schiff, former U.S. champion, one of the great players of all time, and Laszlo Bilak came up from Miami, and they played in the finals. And the level of the table tennis was far higher from those 2 than anything in our region. And it was unbelievable to watch. And they played an absolutely amazing match. And I fell in love with the sport at that moment. And both of those guys went on to be big mentors in my life, especially Saul Schiff. And Saul played doubles with me when I wasn't any good. He carried me to some titles. Always made sure I had equipment when I was young. sold me equipment really cheap so I could sell it to, I supplied equipment to the local sporting goods store. And I made a few bucks every month, and that money was my tournament money. So it was a very eventful tournament. It really started my whole career in the sport.
Where did Saul live at the time?
Saul was in New York.
Okay.
But in the winters, he would like to come to Florida, and he would come and spend some time in Florida every year.
And Belak?
Belak was from Miami.
Okay. So closer, more in your neighborhood, arguably.
Right. Yeah. Belak was the big shooter in the Southeast in the early 60s.
Okay.
Even though he was in his 50s, he was still the best player around.
All right. So you followed up with me after I did an interview of Booz Brothers, and you said you had a story about Pete May. Tell me your Pete May story.
I have hundreds of stories about Pete May and Jim McQueen. They are lifelong friends. I have only one nut to pick with them, is that they would never let me in the Booz Brothers. I asked for years. I would beg, and they told me, "Sorry, you're too serious."
Yeah, he held up a sign during the interview and said, "This person wanted to be in the Booz Brothers. This person wanted to be in the Booz Brothers."
Yeah, that was my goal, and I was never made it. But my one of my favorite stories, because you never know who you impact in life. You know? I had been out of the game. I came back. I actually had like two careers. I had a career until about 1978 as a player and as a coach in some degree. I ended up in 78 in France as playing in the first division in the league, and as the club trainer for a club outside of Nice called the Trinity. And so I was responsible for organizing all the training of the club. And then I also played. I came back in 78 and moved to where my parents were living in Western North Carolina, and there was no table tennis. So I went back into tennis, and for 5 years, I didn't pick up a table tennis racket. So 1984 comes around, I'm starting getting the urge to play a little bit. And somebody told me there was a fellow in Greenville, South Carolina, which is about a 3-hour drive from me, that had a special room for table tennis, and good players came there. So they gave me his phone number, and I called him, and his name was Charlie, I believe, but I don't remember his last name. He was an older man. And I went down there on the given night, and sure enough, there were some good players there. And that gave me an opportunity to get back in a little bit. But above the door in this special made room, which was absolutely a great table tennis room, was this sign, "The Pete May Room." And I went, "Well, I've known Pete since I was a kid. What is this about?" You know? And Charlie told me, he said, "Well, he was playing at a rec center, and a mysterious man came in and beat everybody in the rec center. And Charlie considered himself a very good player, and he went to play Pete, and Pete beat him 21-0. And the man could not believe that anyone could beat him 21-0. So he made a pact with himself. He was going to go home and build this room in order to get good enough to play against Pete. And he put Pete's name on the room, and Pete had no idea this existed. I called Pete up like the next day and said, "Pete, do you know that there's a man that has a Pete May room?" And told him the story, and he was just tickled pink. But you never know whose life you touch, you know? And that was a lot of fun.
Well, let's we'll stick with South Carolina a little bit. So I came to South Carolina in '82. There was not a lot of organized table tennis going on. And I never saw the Pete May room in Greenville, though I did play against Scott Lehman quite a bit over a 4 or 5 year period. He used to come to some of the regional tournaments and stuff. But a little later on in the 80s, you came down, or was that early 90s that you came to coach at Anderson College?
Well, that's where we met, of course, 1991.
We may have met in North Carolina playing when I think you were up helping Bowie Martin's group, or maybe you just came to tournaments up there some.
No, actually, when I got back into it, Bowie lived on the other side of North Carolina.
Okay.
But on weekends, I would drive. It was 6.5 hours. I would drive and spend the weekend there coaching his group of kids,
Yes.
which included Oscar Melvin and Brian Pace and all sorts of juniors that became very, very good. There were other coaches there that were working with them regularly. I just came and helped. James Theriot was there, Ty Hoff. Yeah, were there. They were the primary people. But we had a lot of fun at Bowie's Club.
So how did you find your way to Anderson College?
Well, when the program shut down in Maryland, your father, asked if I would be interested. And I actually had talked to him a couple years earlier when they were starting the program up. But the main draw of coming to Anderson was getting an education. And at the time, it was just a 2-year school. And I already had 2 2-year degrees. So I didn't see the advantage of coming for a third one. But this time around, they were going 4-year. And that was very attractive because I had very much wanted to finish my education. And we moved to Anderson, and I became the coach there. And that was 4 of the best years of my life. Your father was a wonderful man. And very supportive.
Because he's still around and he may hear this.
Well, he was very supportive of the table tennis, and we had a good program. And the other part of it made that work was that my best friend Pete May was running an Augusta College program, 2 hours away. So Pete and I would use each other's programs as big rivals, got to go beat Augusta, and then our players would be killing each other. And Pete and I would be winking at each other, because we had set all that up. We wanted this rivalry. But, between the 2 programs, we always had 10 or 12 or more 2,500 level players. Okay, so, between Pete and I, we orchestrated this atmosphere of competition, and it really pushed both programs a lot. We actually organized a Southern Professional Tour of tournaments based around those 2 college programs. We had 9 tournaments with some pretty good prize money, and an overall champion prize money at the end of the session. So we'd have a tournament, we'd bring both college teams in. Now you got 35 or 40 players at high level, and then all the local people would join as well. So it made for really exciting events.
It was a really good time to be in the Southeast.
It was a great time to be in the Southeast. We had a lot of stuff going on. But for me personally, the college atmosphere and working with young people in that age group, and it's the closest thing to like a European team that we have in the United States, because we were not a club program. We were a varsity sport program. And our players saw themselves that way. We trained every day. Sometimes we trained twice a day. They were all in the same dorm area. They ate together. They went to school together. It was very, very much a team.
So not too long after I left Anderson, we had the Olympics in the Southeast, and you ended up having a very important role there. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your role with the Olympics?
Well, Anderson College made it all possible for me because getting that 4-year degree in '94, without that, I wouldn't have been able to even make an application. The U.S. Table Tennis Association sent out a notice that they would be collecting applications, employment applications for a competition manager, and the competition manager is in charge of the whole sport. So there's 24 Olympic sports, there's 24 Olympic competition managers. They graded the resumes, the local organizing committee, and I was graded the 4th resume. And they decided they were only going to interview the top 3, which absolutely broke my heart. And I called them many times and I said, please let me come down and interview. They said, you don't need to pay my way or anything, And they said, no, human resources said we'll only interview the top 3. And about a month later, after being very disappointed, I got a call saying, can you come for an interview? Which told me that they weren't happy with the top 3. And I got in and was able to convince them to give me a shot. It was interesting how they did it, because for the first 6 months, you're on probation. And then during that time, you have to write the competition staff operations manual. If you can do that, then they figure you know what you're doing. That manual is 300 and something pages. So yeah, that was a stressful first 6 months, but that ended up being an absolutely wonderful experience. Not only for the Olympics, but the Paralympics may be even a better experience in many ways.
And a World Cup too, right? I mean, all of those things were tied together.
Our test event was the 1995 World Team Cup, which had all the best teams in the world, and which the U.S. got a bronze medal. It's the first medal that they had gotten in like 40 or 50 years. They played unbelievably well. And Jimmy Butler got the Player of the Tournament award. And the stands were full. And so it was, you always run an event because you want to make sure that the hall works correctly. The lighting is okay, airflow is okay. The Olympic standard is much higher than any other standard in the world. And even building the wood subflooring had to have a certain amount of bounce. Too much bounce, the table would move. Not enough bounce, the players didn't like it. So it was it was an interesting challenge.
I think you could say that you had already achieved a whole lot just by having those 3 massive events all over that same year or 18 months. But honestly, that was just a launching point for you, right? So what was the next act for you? Where did you go after that?
Well, I was, of course, in Atlanta for that. And I started helping at the local club. I ended up the president of the Atlanta Table Tennis Club. And we had a commission where all the clubs met each month to work together to develop table tennis. And I was the president of the commission. And I also had a training center besides the club at the Windy Hill Sporting Club, which is probably the premier athletic racket sports facility in the Southeast United States. We had tennis, squash, tennis, squash, racquetball, and table tennis. And a $25 million facility, every type of training, physical training, indoor pool, rock climbing. You just can't imagine how nice this place was. And this was my day-to-day working place. We had, restaurant, we had pro shop. They made my reservations for lessons. They had 3,500 members. And I was, part of the staff. And it was such a nice place. We actually held the U.S. team trials there. It was really a wonderful place.
All right. And somewhere along the line, ITTF picked you up to be a coach's coach, right?
Yeah, that's sort of interesting. It happened by accident. Another one of these things that happened by accident. In 1998, there was a fellow, and I don't know who it was, supposed to give a course in Grenada. And at the last minute, he either got sick or he couldn't go or something happened. So I had worked for several years in the Olympics with the ITTF staff, and they all knew me. So they said, well, Richard's in Florida. That's not that far away. Maybe he'll go run over and do the course. And the interesting thing in the old days was ITTF would send coaches over, but the coaches did what they wanted to do. We didn't have any set thing to teach or any material. So I talked to the people in Grenada. I said, well, who's coming? You know, what's your goals? What do you want to do? And I wrote about 90 pages for them in a manual and sent it to the ITTF because I didn't know really what was expected. And I think I was the first one of their coaches to ever send them a manual. And they looked at it and said, oh, can we keep this? And I said, sure. So I did 3 courses the next couple of years, mostly in the Caribbean. And then in 2004, they started a formal coaches education certification program. And I was one of the very first course conductors that they selected for that. And from that time on, we've been teaching standardized courses, almost like a college course, or textbooks, and a step-by-step process that's done the same all over the world. And that kept growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and until the last probably 10 years, it's been 2 to 3 months a year for me overseas. Yeah.
So do you keep track? How many countries have you visited?
Oh, I'm more than 30. I know what I keep track of is who I work with. And so far in my courses, I've had more than 1,800 coaches. And in my training camps and developmental work, more than 4,000 athletes. So it's been,
amazing. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's more than 75 projects for the ITTF.
All right. So what's next? What is on the horizon for you?
That's an interesting thing because ITTF is now redoing its courses and it's going to put a lot of them online. And none of us really knows what it's going to look like. It's supposed to come out next year, or whether or not there'll be any course conductors officially. So I'm not sure if that's going to continue or not. In the immediate time, I think one of my main goals is to write a book on coaching. And I've started that, and that's going to be my main project. And of course, I still coach when we get back to something normal. I still coach a lot here in the Colorado area where I'm living.
Where are you living right now?
Aurora, Colorado.
Okay.
And I have a club called Sky High Table Tennis. I have 11 tables. A nice club. It's only open 1 day a week.
Okay.
But I have we have 4 tables, actually 5 tables at the Colorado Athletic Club here, and do a lot of my instruction there.
All right, Chris. Sorry. All right, Richard. It's probably a pretty good place to call it quits here. It's been interesting catching up a little bit and hearing some of the stories from the person that lived it is all neat. A lot of the history is kind of where I was out of the game and I didn't follow some of the middle years there. I had kind of kept up with you through Anderson College, and then I was off doing some real life stuff there for a while. And
Oh, no, not real life.
So I have managed to work my way back into daily table tennis stuff now, and your name keeps coming up. So I think a coaching book is something that's necessary. You know, how do you coach is important. There's been a lot of pages have been put towards you know, actual technique and some of those sorts of things, but actually learning how to coach, taking advantage of your being a teacher's teacher, and pulling all of these things together from this life of experience. There's a real market for that. And I think 4,000 plus athletes and almost 2,000 coaches out there is a really big footprint you should be proud of. But I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. I think others are going to enjoy listening as well. And we'll have to do this again sometime soon.
Thanks, Steve.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.